More about the nature of the Bible. I find myself in a somewhat odd position here. I feel kind of like the coach from one team who takes a moment during half time to give some advice to the opposition team. I posted a video a couple of days ago about how I thought that Christians were doing themselves a disservice in their debates with atheists because of their attitudes towards the Bible. And it provoked quite a lot of discussion. Great. But I thought it might be a good idea to say a bit more about my position regarding the Bible when I was a practicing Anglican priest and theologian. There seems to be a belief among many Christians, and I suspect also among some atheists, that in order to be a Christian, you have to believe that the Bible is totally infallible and free of all error. I suspect that this is largely under the influence of the very noisy evangelical churches in the USA, which have come to be identified with Christianity among both Christians and atheists. However, these fundamentalist evangelical Christians are not the only Christians in the world, or even in the United States. They're probably not even in the majority. They're just noisier than the rest of them. You don't have to be a biblical fundamentalist to be a Christian. You don't have to believe that the world is 4,500 years old or whatever age they've decided on now. You don't have to believe in a literal historical Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden. You don't have to believe in Noah's Ark. The author of that story had no idea how big the world is, how many species of animal there actually are in the world, or even what a species actually is. And there's no reason for us to think or expect that they should know these things. You don't have to deny science and history and burn out a whole chunk of your brain cells to be a Christian. If you have believed this up to this point in your life, now's the time to breathe a sigh of relief. When I went to theological college, or seminary as some of you probably like to call it, we were taught to approach the Bible critically, to treat it as we would treat any other historical document, to apply all the tools of literary and historical criticism to it. This was done in order to get as close as possible to the cultural and historical context in which the books of the Bible were written, to understand the message that was being addressed by the authors to their target audience, which was usually the people of Israel, and to seek from within those writings some kernels of truth and wisdom that could speak to us in our cultural and historical context. This is basically the practice of exegesis and hermeneutics. The books of the Bible, Old and New Testaments, were written by human beings just like you and me across a period of hundreds of years. They may or may not have been inspired by God or by the Holy Spirit, depending on your point of view. But either way, they remained human beings with the limits of knowledge that were common to the people of that time and place, with all their prejudices and limitations. They expressed their ideas in the words and ideas available to them in the culture around them. And they addressed the issues that they believed were important to the people of Israel at that particular time and that particular place. They were not, in fact, writing for us. Their message was almost always a message relevant to that time and place, even when they appeared to be talking about future events. The theological views of the writers of the Bible were not always the same. For instance, consider the early chapters of the book of Genesis. When you approach these chapters from an historical and literary critical perspective, you realize that there are at least two narratives there which were written by different people from different schools of thought, whose accounts of events and even theological views don't always agree. They were written by different groups of people within Israeli society to address different issues and to express different points of view. At a later date, another author or group of authors has sought to weave these distinct and separate narratives together and probably added some additional material of their own to address the issues that they thought were important in their day. This kind of thing is true of the entire Bible, Old and New Testament. It's an organic collection of writings which has grown over many centuries. There's no reason to think that there is a unified or unifiable point of view in the Bible, even in the New Testament. The theology of the Gospel of Mark and the theology of the Gospel of John are different. They're different and sometimes divergent interpretations. The book of Revelation is different again, and the letters of Paul are different again. You're not going to find a unified theology. And attempting to force a unified theology out of the text as if it's there in the text is to commit violence against it. Interpreting the Bible involves understanding the context in which it was written, the issues it was seeking to address at the time, and then asking how, if at all, this might address issues that we are facing. It may do so, and it may not. From this, it ought to be clear that interpreting and using the Bible requires you to be selective. It requires you to determine what the key ideas are which still have relevance for us today. Some simply won't have any relevance. Some parts of the Bible you'll reject because you can't, in all good conscience, accept the worldview or moral values that are expressed therein. You'll reject some parts simply because they're completely irrelevant today, like many of the laws in Deuteronomy and Leviticus. Some of the stories you may be able to repurpose, but bear in mind that when you do that, you're straying from the writer's original intention. And that can be okay too. The writers of the Bible did that to other writers of the Bible all the time, as in the case of Genesis. The authors of both Matthew and Luke took the Gospel of Mark and used it in their own way for their own purposes. Not only is this how you should approach the Bible, but it is in fact how everyone who reads the Bible approaches the Bible, even the most ardent fundamentalist. They just don't realise they're doing it, or they pretend they're not doing it, or they do it without revealing that they're doing it in order to push their own personal agenda. If you're going to do it, and if you read the Bible you are going to do it, it's best to be honest and open about it, to yourself and to others. Recognise what you're doing and why you're doing it, and have good reasons that you'll share with the rest of us for doing it. That is how I understood and approached the Bible as a priest and theologian. But I didn't simply just jump into the Bible head first and assume that I would understand it or be able to use it. I studied it for years, and not just the texts themselves, but the history behind the text, the context, and the history of the times. I tried as best I could to understand the context and purpose of the text at the time it was written. At no stage did I expect the authors to be infallible, even though I might have considered them at the time to be inspired. Inspiration does not imply infallibility. I still actually think about the Bible that way. I still think it's the only way to actually understand it. The difference today is that I no longer think that the authors were inspired by God. They were people doing what people do in every day and age, trying to understand their place in the world and trying to justify their actions. Eventually, even what I came to believe were the essential elements of the story, if you like, I later realised were misguided, unhelpful, and sometimes downright unhealthy. I've talked at length about that in other videos, and no doubt I will again. If you think that the Bible is actually inspired by God and you believe that means it's completely free of error, if you find that you're constantly having to tie yourself into knots trying to reconcile elements of the Bible that can't be reconciled with each other or with knowledge that we've acquired from elsewhere, say science or other historical records, if you're ever trying to make two equal one, if you're forever trying to prove that black is white and white is black, then I pity you. Get out of that place. You don't have to keep believing the nonsense in order to be a Christian. Millions of Christians already don't. I'm offering you a way out. I'm offering you a different way of looking at the Bible. one which will allow you to remain in your faith if that's what you choose to do, and one which will allow you to retain your rational faculties, and which will allow you to build a belief system that is actually relevant to the world today and relevant to you. You can even continue to believe that the authors of the Bible were inspired by God, if you like, as long as you don't think that this in some way overrides their essential humanity. As long as you understand that the words on the page remain, inspired or not, human words, even though you might think they in some way contain God's words. You can do all of this without having to follow me down a path into atheism, and you'll find it quite liberating.